Okay, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we are unpacking the absolute mechanics behind the fall of human civilizations. Based on the really incredible, exhaustive research of Malcolm Levitt, we're going to figure out exactly how and why complex ancient societies just shatter. Because, we always tend to picture the end of an empire as this singular, fiery event. But the historical and archaeological reality, it's much more intricate and honestly, a lot more relevant to us today than we might think. So what leaves mighty empires in ruins? You think of the Mayan ruins of Quirigua, for example, and it really begs a fundamental question. Are these seemingly invincible states destroyed by sudden, dramatic catastrophes? A massive earthquake, a devastating drought, maybe a barbarian horde coming over the hill? Or is it something much more insidious? Something basically rotting from the inside out?
Here is our roadmap for today's sort of medical autopsy of ancient states. First, the rise of ancient states. Then, the anatomy of collapse, followed by the dysfunctional state. After that, we'll dive into two case studies, the Old Kingdom and the Mycenaean palaces, before finally wrapping up with the system's failure.
Let's start with Section 1, the rise of ancient states. To understand why states break, we obviously first have to understand why early humans traded their freedom to build them in the first place.
For most of human history, we were just hunter-gatherers, right? But, driven by the massive population growth of the agrarian revolution, humanity entered into a rather fragile bargain. The researcher Peter Turchin refers to this as a social contract. Basically, people surrendered a degree of their personal freedom to participate in a centralized state. And they did this fully expecting mutual benefit, security, peace, and prosperity in return. Conflict and liberty were essentially reconciled under centralized leadership. This social cage was held together entirely by the promise that the state would actually deliver on its end of the bargain. Now, the 14th century scholar Ibn Khaldun had a brilliant name for the crucial social glue that makes this work. He called it asabiya. It's this profound sense of communal empathy and common purpose that spans across both elites and commoners. Basically, the people have to genuinely believe the state is actually worthy of defense. But, and this is key, if asabiya dies, if the ruling elites become entirely self-centered and massive inequality takes hold, the state's immune system begins to fail. The people become alienated, and that fundamental social contract, it just completely shatters. Moving on to Section 2, the anatomy of collapse, let's look at the foundational architecture of an ancient state to see what it actually takes to keep it healthy and functioning. A stable society is built sequentially. Think of it like a hierarchy of needs. These are the four core functions an ancient state simply must fulfill. First, it has to manage and assure food supplies, specifically grain, because grain can be stored and taxed. Second, it has to defend against external attack, which requires a funded military. Third, it needs to maintain internal peace and law. And finally, number 4, it must promote a legitimizing ideology. The people absolutely must accept the right of the rulers to govern. If a ruling class fails to deliver on these core promises, the state is completely, dangerously exposed. Which brings us to Section 3, the dysfunctional state. So, how exactly does this well-oiled machine break down and lead to those haunting ruins we talked about earlier? Well, we really have to move away from the whole Hollywood myth of a single cause. It is almost never just a drought or just an invading army. State collapse is actually a dynamic systems failure of a severely weakened organism. It's a cascading chain reaction where internal weaknesses collide with external shocks. If a society has strong asabiya and functional infrastructure, it can totally survive a drought. If it doesn't, that exact same drought becomes a fatal blow. It creates this fatal recursive feedback loop. Elite infighting and a lack of cohesion lead directly to economic mismanagement. That mismanagement ruins the state's fiscal health, which, you guessed it, cripples the military budgets. Now, a weak military naturally invites invasion. That invasion strips away tax-paying territories, which further worsens fiscal health. It's a downward spiral that opens the door to total collapse. So, let's apply our framework and conduct our first historical autopsy. We're looking at an incredibly powerful civilization here, the Old Kingdom of Egypt. If the pharaoh was considered literally divine, a living god who practically controlled the weather, how on earth could it all end in ruin? Let's dig into that in Section 4, Case Study, Old Kingdom. This was an era of massive, unprecedented consolidation. The age of the pyramid builders. A highly centralized administration ruled right from Memphis. And yet, it collapsed into what some historians refer to as a dark age, following the end of the Sixth Dynasty.
94. Just wrap your head around that number for a second. That is the staggering number of years Pepi II reigned. He took the throne at age 6. Now, as you can probably imagine, having a centenarian running the empire in an era way, way before modern medicine created a dangerous power vacuum right at the center of the state. Central authority withered, and ambitious men out in the provinces saw their chance.
Those ambitious men were the provincial governors, known as nomarchs. They were supposed to manage irrigation and collect taxes for the capital, but instead, they began hoarding the wealth, keeping the tax revenues and feathering their own nests. And because they neglected the state's future, key infrastructure, like crucial flood control, decayed. So when a severe drought eventually hit, the state had zero reserves. Starvation set in. Ancient texts, like the Dialogue of Ippur, vividly describe a complete loss of asabiya, the rabble deposing the king, the children of princes dashed against walls. The social contract wasn't just broken, it was violently torn up.
So, the Old Kingdom shows us what happens when a slow, bureaucratic rot meets environmental stress. But this brings us to our second patient on the autopsy table. What happens when an empire faces a sudden, incredibly violent physical destruction, leaving behind thick layers of ash and ruined palaces?
Let's find out in Section 5, Case Study Mycenaean Palaces. Around 1200 BC, these palace states in Greece suffered widespread, dramatic destruction. We're talking about highly centralized, massively wealthy states like Mycenae, Pylos, and Thebes. In a terrifyingly short window of time, they were utterly destroyed. They lost their writing system, their beautiful fresco painting, and their entire political structure. Now, we do see signs of literal earthquakes spanning 50 years. Plus, there is evidence of climate change and long-lasting aridity, which heavily disrupted food supplies. And of course, we have the famous Sea Peoples, marauders disrupting trade routes and raiding coastal cities. But while these were immense shocks, researchers suggest the real killer here was rural collapse. The palace elites were demanding heavy taxes, wool, oil, you name it, from the surrounding villages. They were over-extracting from the commoners, effectively killing the goose that laid the golden eggs. So when those external shocks hit, the squeezed rural population couldn't, or maybe just wouldn't, support the palaces anymore. The system just imploded. All right, Section 6, the system's failure. Let's bring all of this together to really understand the true timeline and the fundamental nature of societal death. Because when we zoom out, we see that collapse is rarely an overnight event. When we map this out, we can see how this pressure builds over time, using the dismemberment of the Western Roman Empire as a prime example. Collapse is a drawn-out, agonizing failure to meet new challenges. The old saying is true. Rome didn't fall in a day. It was a centuries-long erosion. From giving up territories in Dacia in the 3rd century to catastrophic military defeats like Hadrianopolis, all the way to the eventual sackings of Rome. By the time the final emperor was deposed in 476 AD, it was practically just a formality. The state had long lost its ability to fund its military, control its borders, or command the loyalty of its fracturing population. So across the Egyptian Old Kingdom, the Mycenaean palaces, and the Roman Empire, we see the exact same recurring fatal disease: massive inequality, elite self-aggrandizement, and corrupt mismanagement hollow out a state from the inside. It destroys asabiya. It completely destroys the very spirit and communal empathy required for a population to stand up and defend their society when external shocks inevitably arrive. And that brings us to the end of our explainer. We want to leave you with this final, vital question to think about. History isn't just about dusty ruins. It is a mirror. The social contracts holding our modern world together are built on the exact same foundations as those of the ancients, the basic expectation of mutual benefit and shared purpose. So when we look at our own structural challenges today, we have to ask ourselves, are we maintaining our asabiya? Or are we repeating the very system's failures that left the mighty empires of the past in ashes? Thank you so much for exploring this fascinating topic with us.